Death smells like cold river water and burnt sage. I know this because I've been dead for 3 years, and the underworld has its own particular scent, like the moment after a candle is snuffed out. Lingering, final, a little bitter if you breathe too deep. My name is Riven Ash. I'm 22 years old, I'm an Omega, and I guide lost souls through the lower corridors of Caelum's domain for 12 hours every cycle. I was assigned this role 11 days after I arrived here, after the intake warden scented me and logged my designation in their ledgers with the kind of clinical detachment that told me Omega meant very little in a place full of the dead. I thought that was a mercy. I was wrong, but I didn't know that yet. The lower corridors are long and gray lit, illuminated by floating orbs called hololights that drift like jellyfish through air that is always exactly the same temperature. Not cold, not warm, just present. The souls I guide don't speak much. Most of them are still adjusting to the silence of themselves. They follow me in small clusters, their forms translucent and slow, and I walk ahead with my lantern and my list, calling their names when they drift, redirecting them when they forget which way forward is. It's quiet work, invisible work, exactly the kind I wanted. I'd been an Omega my whole living life and spent most of it trying to shrink, trying not to be noticed by alphas who thought my designation was an invitation, trying not to present too strongly, suppress too obviously, apologize for existing in a room that suddenly smelled like me. I had gotten very good at making myself small. Death, I'd decided, was my second chance at that. Riven. The voice belonged to Caelum, one of the senior Shadewalkers, and Omega herself, dead for something like 40 years and unbothered by most things. She fell into step beside me as I handed off my soul cluster to the corridor wardens at Gate 19. "You're being reassigned," she said. I looked at her. "To what?" "Upper level." She didn't meet my eyes. "Direct service rotation." The lantern in my hand flickered even though there was no wind. Direct service rotation meant one thing in Caelum's domain. It meant the Sovereign's spire. It meant working within proximity of him, the Lord of Death himself, the Alpha who had existed since the first soul ever crossed over, one who ruled the underworld with a silence so complete that most of the Shadewalkers in the lower corridors had never even seen his face. "There's been a mistake," I said. "There hasn't." Sal finally looked at me, and there was something careful in her expression, almost like pity, except Sal didn't really do pity. "You've been requested, specifically." My blood, whatever passed for blood in a dead body, ran cold. "By who?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. I reported to the upper spire at the next cycle start, my lantern in hand and my designation suppressed as tightly as I could manage, which was tight enough that most alphas clocked me as a beta on first impression. I'd been doing it since I was 16. It was practically muscle memory at this point. The spire was everything the lower corridors were not. High ceilings that disappeared into shadow. Walls that looked carved from obsidian and moved slightly like breathing. Hololights here burned silver instead of amber, and the air had that same underworld scent but sharper, cleaner, like the river smell had been distilled into something pure and almost sweet. There were other Shadewalkers already stationed in the antechamber. 6 of them, all standing very still, all looking at the sealed door at the far end of the room. I took my place at the end of the line, and then the door opened. I had imagined the Lord of Death many times in the 3 years since I arrived. I'd built him from scraps, overheard descriptions, half-finished sentences that other Shadewalkers stopped themselves from completing. Either way, everyone in the lower corridors instinctively lowered their voices when his name came up. I expected something terrible, something cold and vast, like a storm or an empty sky. What stepped through the door was a man. Tall, yes. Still, the way very powerful things are still, not frozen, but settled, like the earth before an earthquake, like the surface of deep water. Dark hair, eyes the color of silver coins left at the bottom of a wishing well. He wore black, which was not surprising, and he moved through the antechamber the way gravity moves. Inevitable, effortless, without any particular interest in the things it pulls toward itself. He didn't look at us. His attendant, a sharp-faced beta named Voss, who I'd been briefed on, gestured us forward and began running through our assignments in a clipped, efficient voice. To soul processing, record keeping, corridor oversight for the upper gates. I was listening. I was trying to listen. And then Caelum, Lord of Death, sovereign of the underworld, looked up from the document in his hand. He looked directly at me. Not at the line, not at the group, at me. And the suppression I had spent 6 years perfecting, the scent block that had kept me invisible through a living adolescence in 3 years of death, cracked. Just slightly. Just at the edges, like a fault line shifting. His expression didn't change, not even a fraction. He looked back at his document as if nothing had happened, and Voss kept talking, and the 6 other Shadewalkers kept standing still. But I felt it. The moment his scent reached me across the chamber, when a dark and deep and layered like old wood and cold iron, and something beneath both that I didn't have a word for. Alpha. His. I pressed my lantern against my chest and stared at the wall and told myself very firmly that I had died once already. I was not going to survive whatever this was. I learned 3 things about Lord Caelum in my first cycle of Upper Spire service. The first, he did not sleep. Or if he did, it wasn't during any hour I could identify. Every time I arrived at the spire for my rotation, the light was already on behind the sealed door of his inner chamber. Every time I left, it was still on. The second, he was even more silent in person than the legend suggested. Not cold exactly. Cold implied an absence of warmth, and Caelum felt less like an absence and more like a presence that had chosen not to speak. Whereas there's a difference. Absence is a room after someone leaves. Caelum was a room that had decided, with full intention, to keep its own counsel. The third, he noticed everything. I figured this out on my second rotation when I rerouted a soul cluster through gate 12 instead of gate 11 because 11's corridor warden was running behind schedule and I didn't want the cluster drifting. Standard judgment call. Nothing that required sign-off at the sovereign level. At the end of my rotation, Voss handed me a single slip of paper. Gate 11 clears in 20 minutes. Rerouting creates unnecessary corridor overlap. See one line, no preamble. I stared at it for a long time in the antechamber after everyone else had filed out, trying to decide if I was being reprimanded or informed. I wrote back on the same slip of paper, because there was no other obvious way to respond, and I slid it under Voss's door before I left. 11's warden was 17 minutes behind at time of decision. I'll note the distinction for next cycle. Ash, I didn't expect a reply. The next rotation, there was another slip waiting on the corner of my assignment ledger. 17 minutes is acceptable variance. The overlap was still inefficient. See, I looked at that slip of paper for a very long time, and then I wrote, noted. Though efficiency and caution aren't always the same thing, my lord, I slid it under Voss's door again and spent the rest of my rotation absolutely certain I had just ended my assignment in the upper spire in the most unnecessary way possible. The direct encounter happened on the 4th cycle. I was in the records alcove, a narrow room off the main corridor of the spire, lined floor to ceiling with ledgers that logged every soul that had ever passed through the underworld. It was tedious work, cross-referencing intake records against corridor logs, but I'd asked for it specifically because the alcove was small and tucked away, and I could spend an entire rotation without being in proximity to anyone whose designation might react to mine. My suppression had been holding. Barely, but holding. I'd reinforced it with every technique I knew. Controlled breathing, scent-neutral clothing, the kind of deliberate internal stillness that took years to develop. Whatever had cracked in the antechamber on my first day had sealed back up, and I told myself it was a fluke, a stress response. When my designation glitching under the pressure of a new assignment. I told myself that and mostly believed it. I was 3 hours into the ledger work when the alcove door opened. I didn't look up immediately. I assumed it was Voss or one of the other Shadewalkers pulling the same rotation. I kept my finger on the entry I was cross-referencing and said, the Sector 4 logs are misfiled. They've been logged under Corridor 7, but they should be under 9. Someone's been doing this for at least 2 cycles. Silence. I looked up. Caelum stood in the doorway of the alcove. He was close. The room was small, and the doorway was only a few steps from where I was sitting, which meant he was close enough that I could see the details I'd been too overwhelmed to register in the antechamber. The faint silver threading in his dark hair. The way his eyes, that wishing well silver, moved across the room with the particular quality of someone who was always cataloging, always measuring, always 2 steps ahead of the current moment. They landed on me. I stood up. Too fast. My stool scraped against the stone floor, and the ledger slipped, and I caught it with both hands and said, "My lord, I apologize. I thought you were Voss." Clearly. His voice was low and even, not warm, not unkind, simply exact, like a line drawn with a very precise instrument. He looked at the ledger in my hands, then at the wall of records behind me. "You found the misfiling?" "Yes, it goes back at least 8 cycles, maybe more. I can pull the full scope of it if... I know how far back it goes." He stepped into the alcove. There was nowhere for me to go that wasn't closer to him, which meant I stayed exactly where I was and tried to breathe in a way that didn't reveal how loudly my instincts were suddenly screaming. "I've been waiting for someone to catch it." I blinked. "You left it deliberately?" "I left it to see how long it would take." He stopped on the other side of the records table. 3 feet between us, maybe less. "The last 4 shadewalkers assigned to this rotation didn't notice." Something in my chest did a complicated thing that I elected to ignore. "It's not subtle if you know what you're looking for. Most people don't look." His gaze moved to my face with that same cataloging quality. "You wrote that efficiency and caution aren't always the same thing." I held very still. "I did." "Explain what you meant." "It wasn't a request. Not hostile, but not optional either. And the Lord of Death asked questions the way gravity worked, without any real interest in whether you wanted to answer. Efficiency assumes the fastest route is the safest," I said carefully. "Caution assumes that what looks stable might not be. Sometimes those align. Sometimes prioritizing one costs you the other." He was quiet for a moment. The alcove felt smaller than it had when I walked in. "You've been suppressing," he said. The bottom dropped out of my stomach. It wasn't an accusation. His voice hadn't changed. He said it the way he said everything, with the particular flatness of someone simply naming what was true. But the words landed like a stone into still water, and the ripples moved through me in a way I couldn't stop. "I don't know what you mean, my lord." "You do." He looked at me steadily. "You're very good at it. Most alphas wouldn't catch it." A pause, barely a breath long. "I'm not most alphas." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I'd experienced since dying. "It's a habit," I said finally, "not a deception." "I'm not accusing you of deception." His eyes didn't move from mine. "I'm telling you that I see it. That's all." He reached past me, close enough that the edge of his sleeve almost brushed my arm, and pulled one of the misfiled ledgers from the shelf. He set it on the table between us. "Finish the cross-reference," he said. "Flag everything since cycle 40. Bring it to Voss at the end of your rotation." "Yes, my lord." He turned to leave, stopped in the doorway. "Riven Ash," he said, without turning around. "The slip you left, you were right." And then he was gone. I stood in the records alcove for a full minute without moving. Then I sat back down, opened the ledger, and spent the rest of my rotation absolutely failing to think about the way my name had sounded in his voice. There is a phenomenon in the underworld that the older shadewalkers call a thread pull. Caelum explained it to me once, early in my first year. In the offhand way she explained most things. Like the information was obvious, and she was only sharing it because she'd momentarily forgotten I was new. "When 2 souls are meant to be connected," she said, "the underworld knows before they do. It starts small, proximity feelings, the sense that someone is in a room before you see them. Dreaming about a stranger's voice." I'd asked her what caused it. She'd shrugged. "The underworld runs on bonds. It's made of them. Every soul that ever loved someone and lost them, that energy has to go somewhere. Sometimes it latches." "That sounds chaotic," I said. "It is," she agreed. "That's why the covenant laws exist, to keep the latching orderly." I hadn't thought much about it at the time. I thought about it constantly now. It started with the dreams. I didn't sleep often. Dead people don't need much of it. But when I did, the dreams had always been mundane. Corridors, ledgers, the soft gray drift of the lower levels. Forgettable things. After the fourth cycle in the upper spire, I dreamed about Silver. Not Caelum, not his face, not his voice. Nothing I could point to and say there. That is the problem. Just Silver. The color of his eyes, of the hollow lights in the spire. One of the thread I thought I sometimes saw at the edge of my vision when I was near him. Thin as spider silk and gone the moment I turned to look directly at it. I woke from those dreams unsettled in a way I couldn't explain and spent the first hour of every rotation reminding myself of all the reasons this was a problem I needed to eradicate immediately. Reason 1, he was the sovereign, the Lord of Death, an entity so far above my station that the distance wasn't measurable by any unit I had access to. Reason 2, the covenant laws were explicit. I'd looked them up after the alcove encounter in the public record ledgers available to all Shadewalkers. No bonding may occur between the Underworld sovereign and any being of lesser standing. The consequences of violation are categorically irreversible. Categorically irreversible. The ledger hadn't elaborated, which meant the consequences were either too well known to require explanation or too terrible to commit to writing. Neither option was encouraging. Reason 3, he was an alpha, a god-level alpha, and I had spent my entire existence, living and dead, learning that alphas at that level of power didn't want omegas. They wanted what omegas represented: compliance, softness, something to claim. I was not soft. I was not compliant. I was a dead 22-year-old with a sharp tongue and 6 years of suppression practice and absolutely no interest in becoming anyone's anything. I repeated all of this to myself very firmly on the morning of the 6th cycle, and then I arrived at the spire and felt him before I opened the door. A warmth at the edge of my senses, like stepping toward a fireplace in a cold room, and all 3 reasons felt significantly less sturdy than they had 5 minutes ago. The 6th cycle brought a new assignment. I was to accompany Caelum on a sovereign circuit. Once every set number of cycles, the Lord of Death walked the full length of his domain, from the upper spire all the way down to the deep corridors at the lowest level, where souls who had been in the underworld longest sometimes lost their shapes and drifted into something formless and vast. The circuit was a calibration. His presence reordered things, reminded the underworld of its own structure. Voss briefed the rotation team in the antechamber. 4 Shadewalkers, myself included, tasked with managing the logistics of the circuit while Caelum focused on the calibration itself. "Samant, you'll maintain distance," Voss said, clipped and efficient as always. "You do not engage the sovereign unless engaged first. You do not enter the deep corridors. You wait at the threshold." Standard, clear. I should have been in the middle of the group. I ended up at the front without entirely understanding how it happened. Some reshuffling at the last moment, someone stepping back, and suddenly I was the closest Shadewalker to Caelum as we moved into the main corridor of the spire. He didn't look at me. I didn't look at him. We walked. The upper corridors were wide and silver lit, and I focused on the logistics. The intake report I was carrying, the corridor checkpoint times I'd memorized, the 12 things I needed to verify before we reached Gate 7. Professional, focused, absolutely not thinking about the way his presence beside me felt like a gravitational adjustment. Like the air itself was making room for him and pulling everything slightly in his direction. We were 3 corridors down when he spoke. "You've been avoiding the antechamber between rotations." I kept my eyes forward. "I use the records alcove for transition time, my lord. It's quieter. It's also the room farthest from my office." A beat. "I find ledgers calming," I said. I thought I heard something at the edge of his exhale. Not quite a sound, not quite amusement. Something that might have been both, very briefly, before it was sealed back away. "The Sector 4 misfiling," he said. "You corrected it back 12 cycles. You said to flag everything since cycle 40. I said flag. How are you corrected?" Flagging without correcting seemed like half a job. We passed through Gate 3. The corridor warden straightened sharply as Caelum moved through and relaxed the moment he was passed, the way everyone in the underworld did. A full-body response to his presence, automatic and instinctive, like a hell breath being released. I didn't do that. I'd noticed it on the first circuit checkpoint, and it had unsettled me. This absence of the instinctive deference I should have felt. I was an Omega. He was an Alpha of incomprehensible standing. Every biological response I had should have been orienting toward him like a compass to north. Instead, I felt level, clear, like standing on solid ground rather than being pulled toward something. I didn't know if that was my suppression working or something stranger, and I didn't want to examine it too closely. "You're not afraid of me," Caelum said. It wasn't a question. He said it the same way he'd said, "You've been suppressing," like he was naming something he'd already measured and confirmed. "Should I be?" I asked. "Most are." I noticed. I glanced at the corridor warden we'd just passed, still standing at precise attention with his eyes tracking anywhere but Caelum's face. "I don't think fear is useful. It makes you stop paying attention to the actual situation." A pause, longer than the others. "What is the actual situation?" he asked. I didn't have an answer for that. Or rather, I had an answer, and it was the one thing in either my living or dead existence that I was not prepared to say out loud. "A sovereign circuit," I said. "Gate 7 next." He was quiet for the rest of that corridor. But when we reached Gate 7, and I moved a step back toward the threshold as Voss had instructed, his voice stopped me. Low, even, that precise instrument quality. "Stay." I stayed. I stood beside him at the threshold of the deep corridors and watched him work. Watched the calibration happen, which was nothing like I'd expected. No grand gesture, no display of power. He simply stood, and the underworld listened, and the formless things in the deep distance slowly drew back into their shapes like smoke pulled into a container. Quiet, complete, absolute. I stood beside him and felt the thread pull for the first time as something I couldn't explain away. A warmth at the left side of my chest, thin and insistent, oriented directly toward him. The underworld knows before you do. I pressed my intake report against my chest, over the warmth, and stared into the deep corridors and told myself it was the ambient bond energy of a million lost souls. I almost believed it. I found the full covenant text on a Tuesday, or what passed for Tuesday in the underworld, the 7th mark of the current cycle, when the hollow lights dimmed slightly in a rhythm that the older Shadewalkers called the underworld's exhale. It wasn't a Tuesday. There were no Tuesdays here. But I'd been dead for 3 years, and I still counted time in the architecture of the living world because it was the only calendar my mind had ever trusted. It was the 7th mark, and I was in the records alcove, and I found the full covenant text because I'd been looking for it. I'll be honest about that. I'd been looking for it since the circuit, and since the thread pull that I'd spent 6 days pretending was ambient energy and not what it actually was. The full covenant wasn't in the public ledgers. Those only held the summary. No bonding may occur between the underworld sovereign and any being of lesser standing. Clean, clipped, deliberately uninformative. The full text was in the restricted archive, which I did not have clearance for, which meant I spent 2 days finding a reason to be in the corridor outside it before one of the senior record keepers left the door unlatched for 40 seconds while she managed a misfiled intake report. 40 seconds was enough. I photographed 3 pages with the kind of focused efficiency that I usually reserve for ledger corrections, slipped back into the main corridor. Aaron spent the rest of that rotation pretending to cross-reference Sector 9 logs while actually reading covenant law for the first time in my existence. The language was old, formal in the way that very serious things are formal, precise because imprecision would cost something irreplaceable. I read it twice. Then I sat with it for a long time. The covenant wasn't just a rule, it was a binding, one of the original structural laws of the underworld, laid down at the domain's founding, woven into the fabric of this place the way gravity is woven into the fabric of the living world, not enforced from outside, enforced by the underworld itself. If the sovereign bonded with a being of lesser standing, the covenant text said, the domain would begin to fracture, not immediately, not catastrophically in a single moment, is slowly, the way a fault line cracks, invisible at first, widening over time. Souls would lose their paths. The deep corridors would destabilize. The calibration that Caelum performed on circuit would stop working because the sovereign's power was tied to his separateness, to the particular solitude of his position, and a bond would compromise it in ways that couldn't be undone. The consequences weren't just personal, they were cosmological. Every soul in the underworld, every soul that would ever arrive, all of it compromised because of one bond. I put the pages down on the records table and stared at the wall of ledgers and understood, with a clarity that felt like cold water, why the covenant laws existed, why they had to exist, why Caelum's voice had carried that careful thing, almost pity, when she told me about my reassignment. She knew. She'd been here long enough to know, and somewhere above me in the silver-lit upper spire, so did Caelum. He was different at the next rotation. I noticed it immediately, the way I noticed most things about him now, with a precision that had become involuntary, a constant low-level attention running beneath everything else I was doing. He was in the antechamber when I arrived, reviewing reports with Voss, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that he didn't look up when I walked in. Not the deliberate not looking of someone who had chosen to focus elsewhere. The specific, effortful not looking of someone who had made a decision about where their eyes were allowed to go. I took my position in the line and said nothing. The rotation assignment went through. I was pulled from records work and reassigned to Gate 11 oversight, the corridor farthest from the upper spire, farthest from his office, farthest from any area where our paths would intersect. Voss didn't explain the reassignment. He didn't need to. The Lord of Death had made an executive decision about proximity, and Voss executed it the way Voss executed everything, efficiently and without commentary. I spent 12 hours at Gate 11 watching souls drift through the corridor and pretending the warmth on the left side of my chest wasn't pulling steadily in the direction of the spire. It lasted 4 cycles. The distance was deliberate and complete. No more slips of paper. No more alcove encounters. On the 2 occasions our paths crossed during corridor transitions, unavoidable in a domain that was large but not infinite, he moved through the intersection with his eyes forward and his pace unchanged, and I matched his energy exactly because I had my dignity and also because I understood now. I understood why, and understanding why didn't make the thread pull quieter. It made it worse, actually, knowing that on his end he felt it too, knowing that his distance was chosen and deliberate and cost him something, knowing that he was doing the right thing and it was the right thing, and I needed to let it be the right thing. I was very good at letting things be the right thing. I'd spent my whole life making peace with what couldn't be changed. It was the 5th cycle when Caelum found me in the lower corridors at the end of my Gate 11 shift, walking the long route back to the Shadewalker quarters because the long route went past the river, and the river smelled like cold water and burnt sage and felt, in a way I couldn't explain, like home. She fell into step beside me without greeting. "You found the full covenant text," she said. I didn't ask how she knew. Caelum always knew. "Yes. And I understand it." I watched the river. "The laws make sense. The distance makes sense. It's the right call." Caelum was quiet for a moment. "You're not wrong about any of that." "I know. The thread pull doesn't care about covenant law," she said. "That's the problem with it. It's not a choice. It's structural. The underworld already recognized the connection. That's what the pull is. The domain acknowledging a bond that exists at the foundational level." I stopped walking. "What does that mean?" My voice was careful, very careful. Caelum looked at the river. "It means the law says the bond can't be completed. It doesn't say the bond doesn't exist." A pause. "It existed the moment you walked into that antechamber. The underworld felt it before either of you did." The cold water smell drifted up from the river and the burnt sage, and I stood on the bank of it and felt the thread pull in my chest like a compass point that would never move, no matter how far I walked in the other direction. "He knows this," I said. It wasn't a question. "He's known since before you did," Caelum said. "Why do you think he requested you specifically?" I turned to look at her. She met my eyes and the careful thing was back. Not quite pity, because Cael didn't do pity. Something older than that. Something that had watched enough cycles of the underworld to know exactly how these things ended. He requested me to keep me close, I said slowly. And now he's keeping me at distance to protect you, Cael said. And the domain? And himself, I imagine. Though he'd never phrase it that way. The thread pulled. I pressed my hand against the left side of my chest, over the warmth that had taken up permanent residence there, and stared at the river and thought about cosmological consequences and covenant laws and the particular kind of right thing that costs you everything. What happens, I said, Ani, if the bond is never completed? Cael was quiet for a long moment. The pull doesn't go away, she said finally. It just becomes something you carry. I nodded, slowly, like I was learning the shape of something I hadn't touched yet. All right, I said. I started walking again. The river ran beside me, cold and constant, and the hollow lights on the path ahead burned their steady amber, and somewhere above me in the silver spire, the Lord of Death was putting distance between us with both hands. I let him. For now. I lasted 11 cycles before I stopped letting him. 11 cycles of Gate 11. 11 cycles of the long route by the river. 11 cycles of carrying the thread pull like a stone in my chest and telling myself that understanding why something hurt was the same as being okay with it. It isn't. I know that now. Understanding why a wound exists doesn't close it. It just means you can label it correctly while it bleeds. The thing that broke me wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a grand moment or a revelation or anything the underworld would bother to record in its ledgers. It was a Tuesday, the 7th mark, the underworld's exhale, and I was at Gate 11, and a soul came through who was 22 years old and freshly dead, and so disoriented by the fact of her own death that she couldn't remember her name. I sat with her for 2 hours, talked her back into herself, the way you do, gently, the way you handle something fragile, asking small questions until the answers started connecting to each other, and her shape solidified and her name came back to her, like a word on the tip of a tongue. Her name was Mara. She died in the rain. She had a sister she hadn't spoken to in 4 years over something neither of them could fully remember, and she was devastated about it in the specific way that only the newly dead can be devastated, with the complete understanding that time had run out. I guided her to her intake station and watched her go and stood at Gate 11 alone in the amber-lit corridor and thought about running out of time. I was dead. Time had already run out for me in the living sense. What I had now was the underworld's version of it, cycle after cycle of existing, working, carrying, and I was spending it in deliberate exile from the only thing that had made the underworld feel like something other than an endless gray corridor. Caelum was protecting me. I knew that. I believed that. No, I also believed that nobody had asked me if I wanted to be protected. I was an Omega. I had spent my entire existence having decisions made on my behalf by people who decided they knew better. Alphas who thought my designation was a fragility. Wardens who thought my death was a categorization. And now a sovereign who thought my safety was his to manage without my input. I was 22 years old and I was dead, and I was done being moved around the board by people who hadn't bothered to ask me what I wanted. I submitted a request for antechamber reassignment before the end of my shift. Voss denied it before the next cycle started. I submitted it again. Voss denied it again, faster this time, with the particular efficiency of someone executing a directive from above. I walked to Voss's office directly, something no shadewalker below senior level did, something that required a specific kind of audacity I had been quietly accumulating for 11 cycles, and knocked on the door. Voss opened it, looked at me. His expression did the thing expressions do when someone arrives who wasn't expected and isn't entirely welcome. Shadewalker Ash. I'd like to speak with the Sovereign, I said. A pause. That's not a request that goes through me. I know, I'm telling you as a courtesy. I held his gaze. I'll be at the upper spire at the start of the next rotation. If Lord Caelum prefers not to speak with me, he can tell me that himself. Voss looked at me for a long moment with the expression of someone recalculating whether a situation was above their management level. I'll pass that along, he said finally. Thank you, I said, and left before he could say anything else. I was at the upper spire at the start of the next rotation. The antechamber was empty. No other shadewalkers, no Voss, no rotation team. Just the silver hollow lights and the breathing obsidian walls and the sealed door at the far end that led to the inner corridor in his office. I stood in the middle of the room and waited. 3 minutes. 5. The door opened. Caelum stood in the frame. He wasn't in his formal sovereign black. He was in something darker and simpler, the kind of clothing that meant I'd caught him in a working hour rather than a ceremonial one. His silver eyes moved across the empty antechamber and landed on me with that same cataloging quality, that same measuring stillness. He didn't speak first. Neither did I for a moment. I'd rehearsed this. I'd had 11 cycles to rehearse it, but standing in the same room as him after weeks of deliberate distance felt like stepping back into a current I'd forgotten the strength of. The thread pull in my chest went taut and warm, and I breathed through it and held my ground. "You moved me to gate 11, I said. "Yes," without telling me why. "You found the covenant text," he said. "You knew why." "I knew the reason," I said. "That's not the same as being told. That's not the same as being asked." I kept my voice even, the way I kept everything even, controlled, precise, because I was not going to have this conversation from an emotional place. I was going to have it from a true one. "You made a decision about my assignment, about my proximity to you, one about my entire existence in this domain, and you made it without once speaking to me directly." Something moved behind his eyes, subtle, the way deep water moves when something passes beneath the surface. "The decision protected you," he said. "Maybe." I took one step forward. "Or maybe it protected you from having to explain yourself to someone you'd assigned a position without their consent." "Riven, I'm not finished." The thread pull pulled and I let it. Let it be present and real and named while I spoke. "I know what the covenant says. I understand the consequences. I'm not standing here asking you to break a foundational law of the underworld. I'm not that foolish, and I'm not that selfish." A breath. "I'm standing here because I spent my whole living life being managed by people who thought they knew better than me about my own existence. I died and I came here, and I genuinely thought, that I was done with that." The silence in the antechamber was the kind that had weight. Caelum was very still, that settled, seismic stillness that was so particular to him. The earth before the earthquake, the water before the drop. "What are you asking for?" he said finally. "Honesty," I said. "That's all. I'm not asking for the bond. I'm not asking for the law to bend. I'm asking you to look at me and tell me the truth instead of reshuffling my assignment and pretending it's administration." He looked at me. For a long moment, he simply looked at me. And whatever measuring he was doing in that silence must have reached its conclusion because something in his expression shifted. Not open, not warm, but different. Like a door that hadn't been unlocked in a very long time, turning a fraction on its hinges. "You are the only being in this domain," he said quietly, "who does not defer to me. I know. Do you understand what that means? For me? For something that has existed in absolute authority for longer than living memory?" I held his gaze. "Tell me." Another silence. This one felt different from the others. Not closed, but considered. Like he was choosing words for something he hadn't put language to before. "It means," he said slowly, "that when you are in the room, I am aware of you in a way I am not aware of anything else. And I don't have a framework for that." A pause. "When I have ruled this domain for an age, I know what everything in it is. I know its shape and its weight and its place." His eyes stayed on mine. "I don't know what you are." The thread pull in my chest was a steady, insistent warmth. "I'm Riven Ash," I said. "I'm 22. I'm dead. I find ledger misfiling unreasonably satisfying, and I have approximately 0 patience for being handled." I let a beat pass. "And apparently I'm bonded, structurally, to the sovereign of the underworld, which is the most inconvenient thing that has ever happened to me, including dying." This time, the thing at the edge of his exhale was unmistakable. It was quiet. It was brief. It was contained almost immediately behind that precise, measured composure. But it was a laugh. Caelum, Lord of Death, Sovereign of the Underworld, laughed, just barely. Was just once, like a door opening 1 inch. And I felt it in the thread pull like a struck bell, resonant and warm, and absolutely catastrophic for every plan I had to keep this manageable. Gate 11 was a mistake, he said when the moment had settled. Yeah, I agreed. You'll return to upper spire rotation. Yes. He looked at me for one more moment. That cataloging look, but slower now. Less measuring and more something else. Something that didn't have a name in any language I knew, living or dead. Riven Ash, he said. My lord. Don't submit requests through Voss again. If you need to speak with me, a pause, precise and deliberate. Knock. He turned and went back through the door. I stood in the silver antechamber alone and pressed both hands against the left side of my chest and breathed. Which the thread pull was singing. The upper spire felt different after that. Not in any way I could point to in a report or log in a ledger. The hollow lights still burned silver. The walls still breathed. Voss still moved through the antechamber with his clipped efficiency, distributing assignments with the warmth of a filing system. Everything looked exactly the same. But Caelum knocked on the record's alcove door before he entered now. That was new. He didn't announce himself. Just 2 quiet raps, the kind that said, I'm here, rather than may I come in, because the Lord of Death didn't ask permission to enter rooms in his own domain. But he knocked, and I'd look up from whatever ledger I was cross-referencing, and he'd step inside and we'd talk. Not about the bond, not about the covenant, not about the thread pull that was a permanent resident in my chest now, present every moment, stronger when he was close and quieter, but never gone when he wasn't. We talked about everything else, the domain, the deep corridors and the calibration and the mechanics of how the underworld maintained its structure. The history of the covenant laws. He told me things the public ledgers didn't contain, things that required centuries of context I didn't have, and he explained them with the patience of someone who had forgotten what it was like to not know something and was remembering slowly, one explanation at a time. I told him about being alive, about the small, specific texture of a living world he hadn't occupied in so long that the details had gone abstract for him. The weight of rain, the smell of coffee, the particular anxiety of an alarm going off before you're ready. He listened to all of it with his full attention, which was a specific and overwhelming thing to be on the receiving end of, because Caelum's full attention felt like standing in direct sunlight after a long gray season. I was careful not to think about that too directly. I was careful about a lot of things. The first fracture happened on the 30-second cycle. I was in the deep corridor threshold. Caelum had started including me in the circuit calibrations again, standing beside him at the threshold the way I had that first time, when I felt it. A wrongness in the air, subtle and structural, like a vibration below the range of hearing that you feel in your back teeth instead of your ears. Caelum felt it at the same moment. I knew because his stillness changed, sharpened, went from settled to alert in a way that was almost imperceptible, but that I had learned to read over 30 cycles of proximity. What is that? I asked quietly. He didn't answer immediately. He was looking into the deep corridors, where the formless things drifted at the distant edges of the hollow light's reach, and his eyes had gone very still and very silver. A fracture, he said finally. Something cold moved through me. The covenant? Not yet. He turned from the deep corridors and started back toward the upper levels. His pace was controlled but faster than his usual sovereign unhurry. A natural fault. They occur periodically. The domain shifts. It requires recalibration. I followed him. You're sure? A pause that lasted exactly 1 step too long. Yes, he said. I filed that pause away and said nothing. I went back to the restricted archive. Not for the covenant text this time. I had that memorized in the particular thorough way I memorized things I needed to understand completely. I went for the historical records, the domain logs from previous eras, the incident reports filed by sovereigns who had come before Caelum, because there had been others before him, though the records were thin and old and handled with the care you give to things that are almost gone. What I found took me 3 cycles to piece together. The fractures weren't natural, or rather, they could be natural under normal circumstances. The domain shifted, Fault lines occurred. It was manageable, routine, the kind of maintenance the calibration circuit was designed to address. But there was another kind of fracture, one that appeared in the older records with a specific notation, a small mark in the margin, a symbol I had to cross-reference twice before I understood it. The thread pull symbol, the bond mark. When a bond formed between the sovereign and a lesser being, even an incomplete bond, even a bond that had never been spoken or confirmed, even the structural recognition the underworld extended before either party chose anything, the domain responded. Not immediately catastrophically, not in the way the covenant text described for a completed bond. Slowly, in small fractures, the underworld registering the tension of a connection that existed but couldn't be honored, like a fault line under pressure that had nowhere to release. The incomplete bond was already costing something, not the completed bond, not a choice either of us had made. Just the existence of it, just the fact of what the underworld had recognized the moment I walked into that antechamber. I sat in the restricted archive with that information for a very long time. Then I pulled the incident logs from the 30-second cycle and compared the fracture notation against the historical records. The symbol was in the margin. I knocked on his office door that evening. He opened it immediately, which meant he'd known I was coming. The domain told him things I'd learned, the way a body feels its own temperature. I stepped inside and he looked at me, and whatever he read in my face made his expression do the careful, close thing it did when he was managing something he hadn't decided how to handle yet. "You went back to the restricted archive," he said. Yes. "You found the incident notation?" "Yes." I stayed near the door, which was deliberate. I needed the distance to say this clearly. The fractures aren't from a natural fault, are they? Not a question. He heard that. "No," he said. "They're from the thread pull, from the incomplete bond." I kept my voice level. The domain is reacting to a connection that can't be resolved either way, can't be completed without fracturing catastrophically, can't be severed because it's structural. A breath. It's going to keep fracturing, in small increments for as long as the tension exists. Caelum was looking at me with that deep water quality, still on the surface, everything moving underneath. "Yeah," he said. "How long before the small fractures become something that can't be recalibrated?" A silence. "Tell me," I said. "A term, please." He moved to the window of his office, the one that looked out over the full expanse of the domain, the hollow lights drifting amber and silver across a landscape that stretched beyond seeing. He stood with his back to me and his hands loose at his sides, and he was so still that for a moment he looked like something carved. 40 cycles, he said, perhaps 50, before the recalibration stops holding. 40 cycles. In underworld time, that was not long, not enough. "And if the bond were severed," I said carefully, "if I were removed from the domain entirely, reassigned somewhere outside your reach, it wouldn't sever it." His voice was very quiet. "The underworld has already recognized it. Removing you from proximity would reduce the fracture rate. It wouldn't stop it." I looked at the back of his head, at the dark hair and the straight line of his shoulders and the stillness that was costing him something. I understood now. That stillness was never emptiness. It was containment. It was the continuous, effortful management of something vast. "Then what stops it?" I asked. He turned around. His eyes in the silver hollow light were the color of coins at the bottom of a wishing well, and they were looking at me with something that had stopped being measured and cataloged and was simply openly there. "Nothing stops it," he said. "It resolves one of two ways. The bond completes, and the domain fractures catastrophically in the way the covenant describes. Or," he paused, and the pause had weight, "the Omega releases the pull, willingly, deliberately surrenders the structural connection." The thread pull in my chest pulled. "Surrenders it," I repeated. "It requires intent. The Omega has to choose to let it go, fully at the foundational level. If the choice is genuine, the underworld accepts it, and the bond dissolves." He held my gaze. "It doesn't transfer, it doesn't redirect, it simply ends." I understood what he wasn't saying. I understood it in the precise way I understood all the things Caelum communicated in the space between words. He couldn't do it. The covenant law was bound to him as sovereign. He didn't hold the pull the way an Omega held it, didn't have the mechanism to release it. The architecture of the bond sat in me. The choice was mine. It had always been mine. How long have you known this, I asked. Since before your first cycle, he said quietly. Since before I requested your assignment. I looked at him. You requested me knowing this was the resolution. I requested you, he said, because the domain had already recognized the bond, and the fractures had already begun, and I wanted to. The precise instrument quality of his voice faltered, just slightly, just for a moment. I wanted to know you. Before. The words sat in the room between us like a stone dropped into still water. Before I let go. The thread pull in my chest was so warm it hurt. Caelum, I said. It was the first time I'd used his name. Not my lord. Not the formal address that every Shadewalker used, that every being in the underworld used, that maintained the distance the covenant required. Just his name. He closed his eyes briefly, opened them. The deep water was moving. I know, he said. I'm not ready yet, I told him. And I know, he said again. I turned and walked out of his office and down the silver corridor and all the way to the river, and I sat on its bank with my knees drawn up and my hands pressed over the warmth in my chest, and I let myself feel it, fully, completely, without managing it. For the first and only time, the cold water, the burnt sage, the pull like a compass that would only ever point one direction. I sat with it until the hollow lights shifted into the underworld's exhale, and then I stood up and I walked back. I had exactly 40 cycles. I wasn't going to waste a single one. I spent 40 cycles learning him, not strategically, not with the careful, managed attention I gave to ledgers and corridor logs and all the things I'd trained myself to approach with professional distance. And I learned him the way you learn something you've decided to keep, completely, selfishly, with both hands. I learned that he took his reports standing because he'd never developed a preference for chairs, having existed long enough that most furniture felt like an affectation. I learned that the circuit calibrations cost him something physical, not pain exactly, but a specific exhaustion he never named, and managed with a silence that was different from his regular silence, quieter and more inward. I learned that when he was thinking, he went very still, but his right hand moved slightly, a barely perceptible tracing against whatever surface was beneath it, like he was writing calculations no one else could see. And I learned that he laughed rarely and quietly, and that every time he did, it felt like a door opening further on its hinges, 1 inch, then 2, then 3, and that the sound of it did something to the thread pull that I could not describe in any language available to the dead. I learned that he had been alone for longer than I had the capacity to fully comprehend, and that alone for him wasn't loneliness exactly. It was more like a climate, a condition so long-standing it had become structural, become part of how he understood himself, and that I had arrived in his domain and disrupted the climate in ways that neither of us had chosen and neither of us could undo. I learned that he knew exactly what I was doing, storing him up, building a complete and thorough picture to carry forward into whatever came after. He never said it. He let me do it with that full and overwhelming attention of his, and sometimes when I looked up from a ledger to find him watching me, he had an expression that I didn't have a word for in any language, living or dead. I was, I think, the only person who had ever learned him back. The 39th cycle, the fractures stopped being small. I was at gate 7 when it happened. A shudder through the floor of the corridor, deep and structural, like the underworld catching its breath wrong. The hollow lights swung. 3 souls in the cluster I was managing lost their shapes simultaneously, going translucent and formless in a way that took me 10 minutes to reverse, talking them back with a focus that left my hands shaking. The calibration that evening lasted 4 hours, and I stood at the threshold of the deep corridors and watched Caelum work, and the work was harder than it had ever been. I could see it in the set of his shoulders, in the way his hands weren't quite still, in the specific quality of his exhaustion afterward when he came back to the threshold and stopped beside me and didn't speak for a long time. Tomorrow, I said. He looked at me. I'll do it tomorrow, I said. At the river. He was quiet, the deep water moving. Riven. I've decided. I kept my voice even. True. I'm not changing my mind. I just want tonight. A long silence. Then you have it, he said. We sat by the river for the entire last cycle. Not talking mostly. Side by side on the bank with the cold water smell and the burnt sage and the amber hololites drifting overhead. And the thread pull between us so present and so warm that sitting next to him felt like sitting next to a fire in the middle of winter. He told me things he hadn't told me yet. Small things. The first soul he'd ever guided, centuries and centuries ago, a child who had been frightened and who he'd sat with until the fear passed. The way the underworld sounded in its very early days, before there were corridors and ledgers and rotation assignments, when it was simply a vast and quiet dark. Things that had lived only in him for so long that saying them aloud seemed to cost him something and relieve him of something simultaneously. I told him about my sister. I hadn't talked about her since I died. Hadn't let myself, because grief in the underworld doesn't move the way grief does in the living world. It just settles, goes still, and now becomes another thing you carry. But I told him about her, and it didn't settle. It moved. It hurt in the clean way that things hurt when they're finally allowed to. He listened to all of it. When the hollow lights began their exhale, the seventh mark, the underworld's breath going dim and long. I stood up. Walk with me to the river's edge, I said. He stood. We walked. The water was very still, black and silver in the hollow light, reflecting the drifting orbs above us like a second sky. I stood at the edge of it and felt the thread pull in my chest. Compass point, steady warmth, the most real thing I had felt in 3 years of being dead. And I breathed. I breathed in and I breathed out, and I opened the part of myself where the pull lived, and I said goodbye to it, fully, deliberately. None the way the covenant required, genuine intent, foundational release, the Omega choosing at the deepest structural level to let go. I felt it begin to loosen, and then Caelum said my name. Riven. I turned. He was looking at me with an expression that had nothing managed about it. No measuring, no containment, no precise instrument quality, keeping everything level and controlled. Just open. Just him, fully and completely present in a way I had only seen in fragments before, in brief unguarded moments, and now all at once, everything at once. Don't, he said. Caelum, don't. He stepped forward. I have been the sovereign of this domain for longer than your living world has had language. I have upheld every covenant, every law, every structural requirement that kept this place intact. I have done it alone, and I have done it completely, and I have never... His voice, that precise and exact instrument, fractured slightly on the word. I have never once wanted to burn a law to the ground before you. My chest, the thread pull. The fractures, let them come. He stopped in front of me, close enough that the warmth of him was indistinguishable from the warmth of the pull. Let the domain fracture. Let every ancient covenant law in that restricted archive turn to ash. Let the underworld itself decide what it does with us. I will not stand here and watch you surrender this for my sake, for the sake of a law I did not choose, and a consequence I refuse to accept. You'll lose the calibration, then we'll find another way to calibrate. His hand came up, slow, deliberate, it giving me every moment to step back, and his fingers found the left side of my chest, exactly where the pull lived, exactly where I'd been pressing my own hands for 40 cycles. The bond already exists. The underworld already knows it. Every fracture since your first cycle has been the domain acknowledging something it cannot unknow. His eyes, wishing well silver, deep water moving, stayed on mine. I will not pretend otherwise. Not for one more cycle. The thread pull surged. I had been about to let it go. Instead, I grabbed his wrist, not to pull his hand away, to hold it there. If you do this, or I said, my voice was not entirely steady. If you complete the bond, you don't know what the domain does. The covenant says catastrophic. It says irreversible. Caelum, every soul in... Look, he said quietly. I looked. The river. And the river was changing. The black and silver water was moving, not flowing faster, not flooding, but shifting, its surface breaking into light the way water does in direct sun. Except there was no sun here, had never been sun here, and the light was coming from within the water itself. Gold and silver and a deep warm amber that I had never seen in any hololight. Around us along the bank, the same light was rising from the ground, slow and steady, like something surfacing. The hololights overhead stopped their drift and held, perfectly still, perfectly bright, every one of them oriented toward the spot where we stood, the way compass points orient to north. The underworld was awake, not fracturing, not destabilizing. Awake, alert and present, and turned toward us with the full weight of its attention. And in the sensation of it wasn't catastrophe. It was recognition. The domain recognizing something it had been waiting to resolve, the tension of an incomplete bond finally being allowed to move. It's been holding the fractures back, I breathed. It knew. It was waiting for the sovereign to stop being an idiot, Caelum said. And there it was, the laugh, the quiet, barely there sound of a door swinging fully open at last, as he stepped the final distance between us and the thread pull detonated. That is the only word for it. It didn't complete quietly. It didn't settle into warmth or resolve into something gentle and manageable. It exploded, outward from the left side of my chest, outward from wherever it lived in him, in a wave of something that was heat and light and the deep structural vibration of two foundational things finally being allowed to connect. The river erupted upward in a column of gold and silver light that I would later learn was visible from every quarter in the domain simultaneously. The hollow lights burst bright and then brighter and then beyond bright, blazing like small suns strung across the sky of the underworld, in the deep corridors where the formless things drifted and the oldest souls had forgotten their shapes, went still and clear and quiet for the first time in recorded domain history. Every shadewalker in the lower corridors felt it, every soul in every corridor. Cael told me later that she'd been at the river intake station when the wave hit, and she had sat down on the floor and started laughing, which was unlike her, and had kept laughing for several minutes, which was extremely unlike her. The underworld did not fracture, it exhaled, the longest, deepest, most complete exhale, like a tension release that had been building since the first soul ever crossed over, like the domain settling into something it recognized as right, as finally correct, as structurally resolved in a way no covenant law had ever actually accounted for. I was on my knees on the riverbank. I didn't remember getting there. Caelum was with me, both of us on the ground, his hands on my face, my hands on his arms, and the light was everywhere, the gold and silver and amber light pouring from the water and the earth and the air itself. Riven, his voice, his exact, precise voice with all its containment stripped away, and with nothing managed and nothing measured, just open and present and his. Are you? Yes, I said. I was crying, which was surprising, because I hadn't known dead people could cry, and apparently we could. Apparently, under sufficiently extreme circumstances, we absolutely could. Yes. He pulled me forward and I went, and the thread pull, which was no longer a pull, which had completed and settled and was now simply a warmth that lived in me the way breathing lived in the living, automatic and constant and fundamental, hummed like a struck bell finding its resonance. Around us the light was slowly softening, the river settling back into its black and silver, the hollow lights finding their drift again, burning steadier and brighter than they ever had before. The domain had not fractured. It had, by every evidence available, shown healed. Cael's official report to the senior shadewalkers described the event as a spontaneous domain recalibration of unknown origin. This was technically the least accurate thing Cael had ever written, which was impressive given that she'd been writing reports for 40 years. She handed it to me 3 cycles later with a completely straight face. Unknown origin, I said. I thought that was diplomatic, she said. The light was visible from every corridor simultaneously. Spontaneous phenomena often are. I looked at her. She looked at me. The thing that wasn't quite pity and was actually something much warmer moved across her face, and she shrugged once, with the particular unbothered elegance of someone who had watched the underworld long enough to know that the best things in it never followed the rules they were supposed to. "The Sector 9 logs are misfiled again," she said. "Thought you'd want to know." She walked away. I stood in the corridor with the warmth in my chest, settled and complete and permanent as stone, and the hollow lights burning their steady gold overhead, and the cold river smell drifting up from below. Burnt sage and something new beneath it. Something warm, something that hadn't been there before. I picked up my lantern and my ledger and walked toward the upper spire, and 2 levels above me the Lord of Death was waiting, and the underworld, ancient and vast and full of all the souls it had ever kept, hummed quietly around me like something that had been holding its breath for a very long time, and finally let it go.